Okay, welcome back. Today's lesson is going to be dealing with creating textures, putting textures on your 3D objects, your models, and rendering them out so that you can see what the final result will look like. We're also going to look at how we can make textures both inside of Maya itself and making them in Photoshop. Okay, so just to let you know, I have Maya currently turned on, but I also have already loaded Photoshop, okay, so that we can just jump back and forth while we're working. So if you wanted to go ahead and load that up right now, you can. The next thing that I'm going to do, which is absolutely important before we do anything inside of Maya, is to either create or set our project. Remember, if I just come over here and I say open a scene or save a scene, wherever it happens to be coming from. I mean, right now it thinks that the project 3D modeling week number 1 is where we want to work from. That's because the last time I opened this program, that's what it was looking for. So what I need to do is I need to come down here and go Project, New. Okay. Now it is going to stay underneath this AI 3D modeling, but instead I'm going to create a week 2. And just to make sure that I'm going to be saving it properly, I think I'll call it 3D modeling underscore week underscore 02. So we'll say 3D modeling week 2. All right, so we know it's going underneath AI 3D modeling. I'll hit use defaults so that all my folders are here, and I'm going to hit accept. Now, this window may or may not drop down. It may just close once you've hit accept. I'm getting an error, but it's actually a permissions error. It's all happening inside of here because you can see right here. Here's your 3D modeling week 2. If I open it up, here's all my different folders that I need. So it's created. The only difference is that because of the computer I'm using, it doesn't think everything worked out properly, but everything's fine. Okay? So I have a new scene. Currently it is untitled. I haven't saved it as anything, so I'll just go File, Save Scene As, and even though there's nothing in it, I'm going to move down to the Scenes folder and make sure that this is set to week number 2. Go to Scenes, and then I'm just going to put week 2 and save. Alright, now most of you will probably have already begun building the objects for this homework assignment. Currently we were doing the room, but I know we've talked a lot about creating detail and using all of the polygon and NURBS tools to increase the detail and just kind of add that extra touch that makes everything look nice. Today we're going to be talking about something a little bit different. All right, we're just going to talk about texturing and how to implement textures onto our objects. All right. So the very first thing that I want to do, okay, I want to start talking about textures as they exist inside of Maya. And the easiest way to show you this is if I go to Create, Polygon, Plane. Okay. Now I'll simply increase the size of it, come over here, and I'll change my subdivisions to simply 1 by 1. Okay. So if you can imagine, this is essentially a plane, and it has 2, 3, 4 points. That's pretty much it. Okay. Now I'm angling it just so that you can see what's about to happen. All right. Now, currently it's gray. That tells me that if I go into my attributes, I have the original Lambert shader on it. I don't want to touch this. Of course, the default Lambert doesn't do me any good, because if I change this or if I add textures to this, the next object that I make will also have that same texture. So I'm going to go into my windows, I'll choose my rendering editors, and then right here is Hypershade. Now I know this is going off the screen, but we're looking at the Hypershade. Okay. And I know your Hypershade may look a little bit different depending on the version of Maya that you're using, but we'll see that we have a Surfaces section, we have a Materials section, and then we have a lot of these other tabs that currently don't have much in there. Okay, so a lot of these you don't even really have to worry about. But notice that within here we have 3 very basic default shaders. Okay, now each one of these is considered a shader. This one is actually for doing 3D special effects like particles. Okay, this is a particle cloud. Currently we don't have any in our scene, but Maya drops that in there for whenever we do. Same thing as if we have a shader glow. Okay, that means that you can make your objects glow like fire or a light bulb or anything like that. Now we'll get into things like that in a minute, but before we do that, I just want to explain something real quick. Okay, so I'm going to grab a Lambert and make a new Lambert. Now notice that it not only popped up here, but it should have also popped up inside of my work area. If it didn't, okay, like if I say clear, all right, if it didn't show up down here, all you have to do is just use your middle mouse and drag it in, okay? And this is the same thing. If I select this, we see that it's both highlighted, and this is Lambert 2. Now, if I shift over so that you can see that I have my Hypershade window open and I have my Lambert on attributes, and if it's not there, you just hit Control A until it shows up here. Okay, now this is again with this on. We see that I can simply choose a color, and I know that your pop-up window looks a little different. Just by clicking on it, it instantly registers. But the same thing applies. You click on the color, you choose the color you want, either by a specific swatch or within all these different colors. You can also change it to RGB colors if there's a specific color number that you're looking for. Normally I keep it to the HSV because that's hue, saturation, and value. That allows me to choose a color and then get a particular saturated version of it, as well as increase the value. Okay, so it's easier for me to work in this. It's entirely up to you what you want to do. All right, so we'll just hit accept. And currently I have a blue node. Now I'm going to use my middle mouse button to simply drag it onto that object, and sure enough, there it is. Now, if I select the object that I'm working on, you'll see that it, even though it has other tabs, the very last one is that Lambert. If I select just the Lambert itself inside of the Hypershade, I am only solely working on that Lambert. Okay? Now, if we look at some of these other options, and I'll just kind of slide this over so you can see. If I open up and just increase the transparency, look at what happens inside of my screen. You can start seeing through it. Okay, that's very useful for doing things like glass or semi-transparent shapes, or even things like silk curtains. Anything that might be semi-transparent, you can increase the transparency. Now obviously if you go to entirely transparent, your object didn't disappear, it's still there, you can see it, I selected it, but it won't render because you've asked it to be entirely transparent. It might be exactly what you need, it might be exactly what you don't want. So normally you want something to be transparent but still be visible. Okay, now just so you know, inside of Maya, whenever an object or a color is actually black, Maya reads that as a 0, okay, because black is entirely colorless, and I know that when we're talking about RGB, black is the combination of all colors, but we're talking about light information, right? If we open this up, the value of light is set to 0. This is what Maya is reading currently to decide whether or not this is 0 transparency or some transparency. Now once we get all the way to white, and if I click on it, you'll see that HSV, the value, is 1. Maya's looking at that and saying, oh, you want it 100% transparent. Now if I drop this down, we see that those numbers are changing. So if I say I only want it 25% or 0.25 transparent, now we know for sure that this is 25% transparent. If I wanted it 75% transparent, now we have 75. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Ambient color is different though. As I start to increase the ambient color, notice what's happening here inside of my materials preview. It's getting brighter and brighter and brighter. What we're doing is, it's as if light is being emanated from the object itself. Okay, so if you can imagine objects that have their own light power, a light bulb, a lampshade, maybe you're doing something where you want it to feel like light is coming from outside, but you're covering it up. You know, Venetian blinds. This is an easy way to give that impression without having to worry about very sophisticated rendering. All right, so it's very useful, but what happens is, depending on the color that you're using to make it ambient, the color itself can become very pale. Notice that originally we had this nice dark blue, or this medium, you know, kind of a slate blue, I'll call it, And yet, all of a sudden, because we're turning light on inside of it, we're losing some of that color. Now I can come in here and turn it into a bluer version, and so now it's going to render with this darker color of blue. So rather than adding white to it and making it washed out, I'm adding blue to it, and that's increasing that saturation. Now, something else that you need to know about when we have ambient on is that when we start to render things, even if we have no lights in the scene, even if there's no lights whatsoever, we will still see this object. So you can imagine this could be useful for things like lit up signs, billboards, things that are supposed to be lit up, neon signs, street signs, lamp shades, anything that happens to have its own power and doesn't need a light shining on it to be seen. That's what we're talking about there. All right, so I'm going to turn that back to 0. Incandescence is a little bit similar, only it's much, much more powerful. You can see that as I increase it, we are really filling the world with that solid color. Now, if I increase it to a different shade, even if I make it yellow, you'll see that the ambience is eating away at whatever color I tried to make it originally. Does everybody see that? If I make it a light blue, it's becoming light blue. And what starts to happen is that you just have to kind of play around with these two. Ambience is going to make it still visible and still see the shapes of the objects, where incandescence, when it's too high, will kind of flood and wash everything out. Now, it may sound like incandescence is the least option, but in fact, I use the incandescence more often than ambience, just because I like the way that it ends up. All right. Now, for the next one, bump mapping. Sometimes when you want to add details to your objects, the easiest thing to do is to add a map or a texture file that is made up of black and white bumps. Okay, anything that's a bright white color will make it look like the surface is raised, and anything dark will make it seem as though the surface is down. Now, we'll get into those things as we go along, but I'm just kind of walking you through it. Bump mapping can be very useful. It adds very, very great details and realism to your scenes and to your objects. Diffuse. Diffuse, depending on if you've ever used any other 3D modeling software. Diffuse is often considered what the color is, but diffuse is actually the absorption of light. Okay, because if I turn down the diffuse, now we have an all dark object. If I bring it too high, we have a remarkably light object. All right, so the default was about 8, so I can put that back to 8. So just remember that in many 3D softwares, diffuse is what they call the color. That is not the case here. Diffuse is actually how light, or the appearance of how light is absorbed inside of your object. We could get into translucence. Translucence is if you have light shining from behind it, how much light is able to make it through, but we won't be getting into that today. All right, now there's other special effects and matte opacities. We'll get to all of that stuff later, but right now I just want to go to the next step. Okay, now if you look with color, over here there's this tiny little icon, and it looks like a checkerboard, right? We have a white, a black, and a white. Well, if I click on this, it's going to bring up a render node options box. Okay. Now yours may appear a little bit different, but this is essentially what we want to look for. Now I'm going to keep my 2D textures to normal, and that's how we're going to be working for today. If I choose something very simple, let's just start with a checkerboard because it becomes very obvious when we do it. All right. Now, looking here in my surface, I have my node with a checkerboard, and you can see that there's a line connected to it. That means that this has an influence on this object, and we can see that it's definitely the color. And this little icon right here says, well, if you want to know what the color is, you have to look inside of here. But notice what happened on the screen. It's no longer a color at all. It looks like something has gone wrong. It's gray. Well, that's because right now I'm looking at only shaded mode. Remember that if the button number 4 is our wireframe, number 5 is our solid shader, then number 6 is my textured view. Now understand that with textures on, it's using more system resources. And of course, system resources means your computer is having to work harder. Now the computers that you're working on at school, they should be just fine. For most of you who have a fairly new computer, you're working at home, that should be no problem either. Just understand that the ability to see textures like this and to move around is all being done by your graphics card. Alright, so if you don't have a really powerful graphics card, this may not be presented very properly. Alright, but that doesn't mean that it's going to render wrong. It only means that it's not going to give you the best preview. Alright, now if we look at this inside of the hyper shade, we can see that, like I said, there is a line that is connected to my shader. And if I roll over it, you can see it says checker out color. That means that the color is going that way. And it's being put into the Lambert's color, right? Lambert 2, that's this object, and it's going into the color. Now, if I click on the checkerboard itself, I get the checkers options. And just like before, if I want to, I can change the color of my checkerboard colors. Okay, and as soon as I do that, you'll see that it changed inside of our preview. So that as I increase or decrease my colors, my checkerboard is changing too. Okay, now inside of this checkerboard, not only is there the colors to choose from, there's also this over here, this additional node that's automatically created when I created this node. This is the 2D texture placement. All right. Now, the reason that it's called that is that this is a 2D texture, right? 2D, two-dimensional. It's not 3D. It is a flat object. It has one side of height, one side of width, and that's it. So we know that just like the image appears right here in our preview, this flat image ends up on this flat surface. But watch what happens if I start to change some of these, especially rotate. It's the easiest one to see. As I start to increase this number, you see that my texture starts to spin around. Okay? Now that means that if we wanted our 45-degree angle instead of a regular checkerboard, right? Instead of it being flat like a chessboard, maybe I wanted my design to be 45-degree angles. Okay, so it just adds detail, and it allows me to sometimes put things right side up depending on how your texture works, and other times it just helps to add a little bit of detail to it. Repeat U and V. Now understand that when we talk about textures, the U and the V are the across and the down. Alright, so if I have my UVs are going to be a phrase that you're going to be familiar with for quite a while, because when we talk about texturing in 3D, we talk about creating UVs. Now currently, because this polygon plane is so simple, its UVs were simple too. Now the repeat is because this is a checkerboard, so Maya's already set it up so that it would automatically have 4 by 4. Now if I changed this to 1 by 4, we see that we only have coverage of 1 and then of 4. If I change both numbers of the U and the V, there is my 1 to 1. So 1 to 1 is checkerboard, white, blue, blue, white. If I begin to increase this number, let's go with 6 and say 6 by 6. Notice that we now have more points or more squares on our checkerboard. It's repeating more often. If I go to 10 by 10, then we have even more. Now understand that right now it looks like it's getting blurry, but that's not what's really happening. It's just that my computer, in order to save those precious system resources, is reducing the quality of what I'm looking at just to make life easier. Because eventually I could go up to 100 by 100, and then it would simply say, I'm not going to try to show you what that looks like. Okay? So let's just go back to 4 by 4, because that's the way that it originally was. Okay? Now, something that you need to understand, especially with polygons, if I were to create, let's say, a polygon sphere, okay, and I apply this exact same texture to it, Well, it certainly seems to look right. And that's because this object is able to repeat itself, right? Because if I had 1 to 1, then if I look at this object, we have definitely 1 to 1, all right? Now, how on earth is this object that's three-dimensional showing me the texture properly the same way that we're looking at it on that one? Well, because each one of these objects has what's called a UV map, remember, repeat UVs, there's that UV, it means texture. I'm going to just hit my space bar, and I'm going to use one of these other windows that I rarely use for anything else. And remember, I'm a creature of habit. For 13 years, this window right here has always been what I create my UV map settings for. It doesn't really matter. You can choose any of your other windows. I'm going to choose this one here. I'm going to go to Panels, go to Panel, and then here choose UV Texture Editor. So when I click on that, notice what we have here. Okay, now if I deselect my sphere, everything goes and it disappears. As soon as I click on one of my objects, as long as it's a polygon, it's going to give me this. All right, now understand that when I let go, let's just take a look at this real quick. And I know that there's a lot of buttons up here you haven't seen yet, but we will worry about that in a minute. Right now we're looking at a grid. Okay, now if we look at the numbers closely, this is a 1, this is a 0, and this is a 1. Everything beyond that has a negative number. This is a -1, this is a -1. So just like when you were in 3rd grade math class, over 0.5 and up 0.5 puts you here. -0.5 down -0.5 puts you here. The reason that when I select one of my objects, all of my points end up here, and I know it's really hard to see, but we'll show you how to make it look more obvious in a second. All of your UV mapping should exist inside of this one perfect square. Now I know it might not make a whole lot of sense because sometimes texture images aren't perfect squares, but just remember, Maya, in order to keep their brain simplified, always likes things to be stuck in a square. All right, so if we go beyond this, we'll start to repeat it, and I'll show you what that means later. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm just going to come up to Image, and there's this option here called Dim Image. As soon as I do that, you see that all of a sudden I can really make out each one of these polygon points, and that's what these are. These are representing the faces of this object. So that means that if I right-click on my object and go to Faces, and I choose one, and I look at it here, there it is, highlighted. Everything else disappeared. Now, as soon as I let go of that, I see it all again. And notice that if I select many of them, then we can see all of them highlighted. Okay? Now, this is the difference though. If I tried to select a vertice from within this, I can't move it here. I'm hitting W and it's saying, no, you're not allowed to move this. This isn't what we do here. Okay? Here, I'm allowed to move them. I can grab them and I can move them and do whatever I want. And notice that the texture is changing, right? The texture is stretching to meet the changes, but nothing is changing down here. All right? The same thing goes in the opposite direction. If I right-click on my object now and say UV, notice that we've never really touched on this yet. UV, and if I highlight them here, I even get a warning. It says, warning, some items cannot be moved in my 3D view. This is obviously my 3D view. I cannot drag them around from inside of here. However, what I can do is drag them around inside of here. Now I'm just going to select a few points. Here you can see these are the ones I'm selecting. And if I look over here, you can even see that those points right there represent the points that I'm selecting here. So that if I start moving them, I begin to change how the texture exists on my object. Okay, so let's just do something really obvious. I'm just going to grab all of these down here. Okay, so I have them all the way from the bottom to this line here. and I'm going to scale my UVs. And watch what happens here. So by scaling them, I'm changing how much of the image is allowed to be on one of these faces. Okay? Now, done right, it can help you. Done wrong, it can hurt you. Just understand that. Because as we start going through and changing a lot of these, this is going to start becoming a little bit more complicated. But look at how easily I was able to change the pattern of my shape simply by dragging the different UV points to different locations. And if I do the same thing, I drag them this way, now I have something similar going on up there. Now, if I don't like how this is working, that's because of the location of this last one. And if I drag just slightly, I think that starts to clean it up a little bit. All right, so I'm going to right-click and go back to Object Mode, and now I can select my sphere. And now I've changed my UVs, because looking at them here, they definitely look different than they used to. But the shape of the object hasn't changed. The shape is still a sphere, but the placement of my texture is very different. Okay? So, the first thing that we need to understand is when we're talking about texture mapping and we're talking about creating the UVs, we need to understand that inside of 3D world, there's one set of information, and that's how it looks in 3D. The other piece of information lies hidden inside of it, and that's the UVs. The UVs is how the image sits on top of my object. Okay? Now, we're going to do some more experimenting just so that we can really understand how all of this is working. Okay, so for this next piece that we're going to be working on, I'm just going to delete my sphere because I don't need that right now. And I'm going to bring my plane back over. I'm going to go into my attributes, regular click and just drag up so that we highlight all of these and just go back to 0. By zeroing all that out, we go back to its original placement, and that's where we want it right now. Okay. For this next piece, you're going to need Photoshop open. I also would like you to grab the week number 2. You'll see that after the video, we have a couple of textures. I'd like you to grab those, copy them, and I want you to put them or paste them inside of your project folder. So it would be 3D under source images. Okay, so here's my work project, 3D modeling week 2. Open that up. There's my source images folder. Here are my 2 images. I need them there because you're about to see what happens. So far, you've all heard me talk about how important it is to set your project properly. Because if it's not set properly, problems are going to happen. And here comes the first one. If I open up my Hypershade, let's say, for example, that we're done with this texture. I definitely don't want my checkerboard anymore. I'm just going to highlight on both the checkerboard and its 2D texture placement and just delete it. Now we're back to a simple, standard gray shader. And with that selected, I'll go into its attributes. And this time, I'm going to choose to click on that same little icon, but instead of using a checkerboard, I'm going to tell it, create a file. Now when I hit File, you'll see that we get those same standard 2D texture placement and then the node. But there's something different about this node. It no longer has that checkerboard. It's a blank black file. That's because currently it doesn't know what it wants to put in there. So you notice here it has a browser and it says the image name is nothing. As soon as I click on that browser, look at where it's automatically taken me to. The 3D Modeling Week 2 Source Images folder. And so I'm going to choose the color Stone 11M because it's a medium-sized file, and I'm going to hit Open. Now I have my stone texture on my node, and if I come over here, sure enough, there's my stone texture on my plane. Okay, now I'm going to raise this a little bit so you can see, and that's it. Now, let's say, for example, that you have an entire room and you must obviously be rich enough to own marble or stone tiles that are half or 25% of your entire room. That wouldn't happen, right? So what we need to do is we need to change how many times this image repeats. And we've looked at that before by going into the 2D texture placement, and just like the checkerboard, we're going to increase this repeat U and V. Now notice, because we created a file, by default the repeat U and V is 1 to 1. So I'm going to change this to, let's say, 10 by 10. Now when I look at my floor, I have a very well created tile floor, and it definitely looks like stone. However, there's some things that we need to do with this. Now I'm just going to shrink this down so we can look at the main area of this window, okay? And from this view, I need to render this. I need to know what it's going to look like, because right now it looks okay, but I have no idea what it's really going to look like in my scene. So if I come up here to this little icon, render the current frame, I'm just going to click on it, and you're going to see a window pops up. Now, depending on the speed of your computer and the complexity of the image, this might take a few seconds, or it might take no time whatsoever. For me, I have a fairly fast computer, and you can see it says render time is 1 second. Actually, it was probably less than that. But notice that right now the texture looks pretty good. But if I do a couple of things, let's say, for example, I'll go to Create, Lights, and let's just start with a simple point light. A point light is basically, if you can imagine, a light bulb or a star or something that can emit light in all directions. Okay, so we know that number 4 gives us our wireframe, number 5 gives us our shaded view, number 6 gives us our textured view. Well, common sense would tell you number 7 gives you your light view. Now, it may be hard to see on this video, but as I move this around, you can see that it really is trying to show me what my light looks like inside of this world as I move it around. Okay? Now, just the way it is, because it has light on it, let's go ahead and do a render again. And sure enough, there you go. It has a stronger area right where the light starts, and it gets weaker very, very quickly as it goes away. Now, there are tons of different ways to make lighting look more realistic, but what we're really concentrating on is whether or not the stone looks realistic. So I'm going to get closer to it, and I'm going to render it again. Okay, so here we go. This is starting to look pretty good because, believe it or not, this was a photograph created specifically for 3D. There are whole volumes of libraries dedicated to texture mapping, okay? And so they've created libraries of textures. Now, we can make our own, and we're definitely going to do that. But I just wanted to show you how easy it is sometimes, all right? Now, this is looking pretty good, but it's definitely missing something. All right, it's missing that feeling of depth, because we know that if we look at the object itself, we know that it's just a plane. It is a flat surface. No matter how hard I try, it'll never look any different than that. However, with the right amount of trickery, we can make this look fairly realistic. All right, so I'm just going to angle my camera again, and remember, the perspective view is your camera, and I'll zoom in a little bit so that we can definitely see how it changes, all right? And I'm going to go into Photoshop and notice that I have not only the color image, but there was something else right next to it. And I've opened this up because I wanted to show you that what we're really looking at is, in fact, a RGB image. It is not a grayscaled image. It is an RGB image that is simply black and white, okay? So, going back into Maya, I'm going to select my plane, Control A, and this time, instead of color, I'm going to go to bump mapping, and it has that same texture icon. I'm going to click on it. I'm going to choose File, and then we get this, and we'll come back to this. Don't worry. Just by default, it's fine right where it is. We're going to make adjustments later. We're going to go over to the tab where it says File, and it's going to ask me what the file name is. Now, we want the Stone 11, M, medium, B for bump. So I'm going to click on this, I'm going to open it, and there it is. So when I come back here, I'm just going to use the little back and forth buttons here, okay? so that I stay at the bump map node. And now I'm going to render it again. Okay, that doesn't look great at all, does it? In fact, it looks awful, and there's a reason for it. If we go back into our hypershade, we'll notice a couple of things. Okay, now we first have to, because we've been affecting this texture, we haven't been updating it. So I'm going to choose the texture itself, and I'm going to choose this icon right here, Input and Output Connections. It's basically asking to refresh what's going on. So when I click on it, notice how much more we've added to this. There's my texture for my bump map. There's my texture for my color. Now, what is different? What is it about these two shader images, these textures, that looks so different? And I'm just going to change the size so you can see it, obviously. Some of you have probably already answered the question. Remember, we repeated the U and the V 10 by 10, whereas the new texture that we've created its own 2D texture placement node, and it's still default 1-to-1. So it's not matching up with this other texture. Now there's two ways to do this. Yes, you can simply come over here and say, change that to 10 by 10. But you can also do this. If I select that texture placement node and simply delete it, I can use my middle mouse button and drag the original over to my file and simply say default. And instantly, now this one node is creating both my color and my bump map. That's going to be very, very useful, especially if we ever need to change it. If we say, you know what, 10 by 10 just isn't enough. Maybe it needs to be 15 by 15. Maybe it needs to be 40 by 40. Rather than having to go and to change it every single time twice, I'm now actually sharing my 2D texture node so that every time I change this number, let's just go back to 2 by 2 just so you can see it happen, it updates for both. How useful is that, right? So let's just go back to 10 by 10. And now we'll re-render our image. Now I've shrunk my window down, but if you need to, you can always just click on the icon up here again. Or if you have your render view open, it's this icon right here, redo. So we'll click on it now. And now we're starting to get something that feels a lot more believable. The lines are lining up, and we'll talk about how that works. But right now it looks almost like a carpet, doesn't it? It's just a little too bumpy. This is supposed to seem like a very nice, natural, soft, yet textured effect, right? So we need to just keep adjusting this. So I'm going to open up my shader again. And this time, instead of the placement, I'm going to go back to that bump option. So when I click on the bump options, there's my tab, Bump 2D. We see that bump depth is set to 1. Now that means that it's pretty high. That means that for every slightly grayed or darker shade, it's going to feel like it's being pushed down, and for every light area, it's going to feel like it's coming up. Now, it may seem a little odd, but we're going to drift this down by, let's say, 0.2, and I'll hit enter, so that we can re-render just to see how it looks now. Now you can see that it's becoming a lot easier and a lot more natural looking. But as far as I'm concerned, it still needs to go down some. So I'm going to change this to 0.05, and we'll render. Now it's becoming something that really is feeling like it would be a natural stone floor. Now, it's entirely up to you if you wanted to continue making this more smooth, less smooth, whatever. But the way that it sits right here, I think we're all right for this example. But there's something else that you need to understand. What we're looking at right now, this is entirely 100% artificial. It is a fake detailer. Okay? The reason that I'm saying it that way is because if I create a polygon sphere and I apply that same shader to it. I'll just close that out for now. I'll drag this down. And let's say, for example, that this was supposed to be a really heavy, thick, bumpy rock. Okay? Well, if I render it... Oh, it's outside of the light. Hang on. I think I actually put it in the light. Bring that up. There we go. If I render this, it's definitely looks like it's bumpy. However, there's something that you need to understand. If we get close enough to it, you're going to start seeing that it's all fake. None of this really exists. It's simply looking at where the light is, and it's adding darkness below and brightness above. So really, it's not changing anything. It's only giving us an artificial detail. Okay? Now, as time goes by, that's going to start making a lot more sense. But I just wanted to make sure that you all understand it's not changing the shape of your object. So even if it looks right, from a different angle, it might not. Now for floors, that's perfectly fine. That makes complete sense that it would be something that would just have some texture to it. So I'll go back to 0.05. Now, there's something else that you need to know about lights and rendering. Sometimes you don't really get the full effect of your detail unless you have shadows. Now, if you notice, if I create another object, let's go and make a sphere, and I'll put that right here. Okay? Now, if I go ahead and render this view, notice that we have darkness here because the light was here. The light's here being shined down. And yet, we're missing some things that really increase the realism of the scene, right? We're missing shadows. Maya, in order to make sure that things aren't always on, by default, does not have shadows turned on. And that's to save time. Because if you make, say, 10 different lights in your scene, and you had all of them with shadows, it would take a while to render. Rendering, of course, takes a while. So, if I come down to my shadow options and I'm inside my light, I have some options down here. Now, the very first kind of shadow that you can choose is the simplest type of shadow, which renders very quickly and gives you at least a fair result. And there it is. There's my shadow. Okay? Now, if I pull back a little bit, we need to do something else. Inside of my perspective view, if I go to View, Camera Settings, and I'll open this up so you can see, I need to go to the Resolution Gate. Instead of No Gate, I'll turn on the Resolution Gate. And what I get is a frame just as if I was setting it up in a camera. This way, I know for sure what will and will not be in my scene. Okay? That means that everything beyond this green line won't be in the shot. So when I click, I know for sure that that was the image that I was expecting. Okay? Now, you see that this is definitely a very dark shadow because the light was coming from here. But something happens when you get really close to it. We start to notice how not so great this shadow is. That's because if you look at the name, the depth map shadow, it is actually creating a 512 by 512 image that it will artificially project down here. So because we have something with a limited resolution, if we go 1024 for example, and I render it again, you'll see that it took a little longer to render, but it is starting to look a little softer. It's starting to look clearer again. But it also took longer to render. So if I say, let's just start at 720, that's a good number. Down here underneath filter, if I change filter, this is basically like putting a Gaussian blur on my image, and I make that 3. Now when I render it, I get a little bit of a softened edge. That's going to take away some of those digital pixely look. Okay? Now I can also change the color of my shadow. And most of the time, if your color of your shadow is like a light blue or like a very dark blue, then it'll just start feeling a little more realistic. See that? Now I'm not getting something that is absolutely completely black. I'm getting something that still shows that there might still be light in the world. Okay, it's just a really easy way of giving us a nice little fake shadow effect. I'm not going to get too far into lighting today because that stuff is going to be coming later. But just know that if we turn on this depth map shadow, or DMAP, depending on who you're talking to, when we turn that on, our settings are usually set remarkably low, and it will not give us a fantastic result. It will give us a result that helps us to see the world, but it's not going to give us it 100%. There are many other ways to create lights and shadows that will give you a more realistic look, but for now, just so that you know what you're looking at, you can always just turn it on, keep it to 512, and make that filter like a 2, so that when you do render something, you will start to get at least something that's helpful. Okay? Now, there's some more things that we want to talk about with textures. And let's just grab hold of this sphere now, because we have the potential to add something to it. Right now it's that default gray, so we can do some more things to it. All right. Now, instead of having to work around this, you can just come over to Graph and say Clear Graph. Now we're clear. All right. And before we move on, why don't you go ahead and save your scene? So just Control S, and there we go. Okay. Let's say, for example, that since we've already covered a couple of these different nodes and I started talking about them, let's just make some as we go along. Now, instead of making a Lambert again, because we've been doing that already, I'm going to choose a Fong. And a Fong is a surface that has a shine to it. That means that wherever this light is, we will see that it will have this nice, sharp, shiny quality to it. So again, I'm going to use my middle mouse button and I'm going to drag it onto my object. And there it is. There's our shine. And Maya's trying its hardest to show me where that shimmer is going to come from. Okay? Now, I'm going to first create a black object with a shine. Now, when I create a black object with a shine and render it, here it's basically like a bowling ball, right? We have a very dark object that has a shine on it. So it's visible, but it's not at the same time. All right. Now, in order to make things even more clear, I'm just going to do this. I'm going to select my plane. I'm going to duplicate it by hitting Control D, and I'm going to rotate it and move it upward. I'm going to slide it over. Okay. Then I'm going to do it again. Duplicate, rotate it the opposite direction, and slide it over. Now I have this sort of a checkerboard bathroom tile, so that when I render it, we see the entire object. I didn't want you guys to think that the object was being cut off. I wanted you to see everything, okay? So that when I render this, we have this shine, we have a shadow, and we have an environment, okay? Now, let's say, for example, I wanted to create some incandescence. If I simply turn on incandescence and I render it now, there it is, and my object is now glowing or turned on from the inside. Now notice what's happening. It's looking very, very unrealistic. Okay? Now let's say, for example, that I take my little light and I put it outside. Now that it's outside, and I'm going to turn off my incandescence, and I'll just shoot like this so you can see. When I render it, we have light here, but none here. Okay? It is a dark room. Watch what happens if I turn on incandescence. Even though there's no light in this scene, this object is very bright. Okay? So incandescence creates a power for the light to own. Whereas ambience, if you'll notice, ambience on a black object does not. However, let's say, for example, it's really a blue color. Now we can see it. Okay? This is why ambience is sometimes a little tricky. All right? Incandescence simply turns on the surface regardless of what's around it. And you'll notice that even at a low level, it's still visible. Okay, now it's not as visible, but you can see that even though there's no light in the scene, the object still has a color. All right, now let's say, for example, we wanted to create a map using our incandescents. Okay, now we've talked about checkers, we've talked about choosing a file. Let's choose a different one. Let's start with a grid. So if I select grid, I have a line color and a fill color. Now notice, this is not going on the color of my object, it is on the incandescence of my object. So if I come over here into my scene and I render, even though it's dark because the light's outside, my object is turned on. Okay, the visibility of my object is there. And for all of you Tron fans out there, how about that? There we have a blue grid pattern on our object. Now, if I want to, I can reverse this so that the line is black and the fill is the bright area. And now we have this. What I can also do is, remember, if we have these little icons up here, right? Each one of these simply means that I can add another node to it. So let's choose my fill color, and I'm going to choose a ramp. Now, a ramp offers the ability to go from one color to another, just like a gradient inside of Photoshop. A word of warning to some people who might be using Macs at this point: this icon might give you serious issues. The way that these are presented, if you drag it and let go, you may not be able to select it again until you do this. And I know it's ridiculous. You just kind of have to move up and down and then come back and you're able to move it. All right. The reason that I know that is because my wife has a Mac and she has that same problem. And it's a MacBook Pro. All right. It's something about the operating system or the interface. If you're using Maya 2011, this issue may have been solved, and I say may, so just know that that might be an issue, okay? Now, with the default gradient the way it is, I'm going to re-render it now. And this is what we have. Because it's a linear, we're looking from the bottom up, just like my color is from the bottom up. And if I change the location of these objects and I re-render, it also updates. Okay? Now, if I select the little sphere, I can change this to any color I want. So that when I render again, it changes as well. I can also simply select inside of this area and change it to add colors. So that when I do a test render, now I have all those colors as part of it. Okay? Now, currently the interpolation, or how the two colors blend, is set to linear. I can change it and set to smooth so that there's a much smoother transition between the colors, or I can set it to none at all. Now I have solid colors so that when I render it, I'm looking at solid bars of color. All right. Now, understand that currently, and I'm going to select my Phong, and I'm going to just use that same input and output connection so that I can see everything that's going on. Currently, this is attached to the incandescence. Now, we've been playing around with the incandescence, but let's say, for example, I don't want this anymore. I don't want it glowing. Well, all you have to do is, rather than delete everything, you can either just pull over here, select the actual connection, that little rubber band being connected to each other, and delete that. And that will remove and not delete completely my shader from my, my texture from my shader. So here we have our grid, which currently has just white, and that sort of thing. Or you can come over here to the incandescence node, right-click on it, on the word, notice I'm right-clicking on the word, and simply say break connection, and the same thing happens, okay? Now, with that said, if I grab hold of my ramp and I use my middle mouse button, excuse me, I'm going to first select my Phong, and I middle mouse drag, I can drop it right inside of the color, and now it has actually become my color shader. However, rendering it now is going to result in what? Black. Why is that? Well, that's because my light's still hiding. So if I bring it back in here and I render it, now it's a colored sphere that is still listening to the light information in the room. Okay? So let's say, for example, if I select my ramp, currently it is a V ramp, meaning that it's going from here to here. Okay? Well, if I flip it and change it to a U ramp, what do I make now? I made a beach ball. Okay? Now, you may notice that currently the image itself is kind of clunky. The reason that it's clunky is because my render settings are very low. Okay? So if I come up here to my render settings window, that's this up here, this little checker, this little clapper board. You can also find it from going to Window, Rendering Editors, and it's underneath the render settings. Okay? You get this window that pops up. Your window will look a little different, but that's no big deal. Okay? What you're looking for is simply this. The image size is currently set to a very low image, a 640 by 480. That's a fairly small image. If you want to, you can drop this open and choose from one of the preset sizes. If you go HD 720, now you're looking at a 1280 by 720 image. That's going to be definitely big enough. However, if you go to the next tab, the Maya Software tab, notice that quality is set to very low. If we change that to let's say a production quality, it says it will be doing anti-aliasing at the highest quality. So that when I render this time, not only do I get a larger picture, but I also get a much, much cleaner picture. However, notice that we also have edges that are becoming very obvious because this is a polygon object. Okay? So just become aware of those things. And how do we increase the smoothness of an object if we haven't deleted history? Come over here, subdivisional heights, and increase it. And then when we render it now, we have a much smoother object. Plus, if I look at it at 1:1, it's looking very, very smooth. And by the way, the 1:1 image is if you've accidentally zoomed away or you zoomed towards it, and you start to do that, you're like, oh, wait a minute, go back to what it was supposed to look like. There you go. Okay? Something else that you might need to know is that as you're clicking on this render preview, you're creating images, and that's true. However, they're currently going into a temporary directory. They're not being saved where you'll find them later. Okay? So if you want to save any of these pictures while you're working, you need to go to File, Save Image, and notice where it takes you. It instantly takes you to the Images location of the folder. Now, by default, Maya wants to save all of their images as a maya.iff file, and you can choose whether you want it a TIFF or a Targa or a JPEG or something else. Okay? So I'm just going to do this. I'm going to call it beach ball. Okay. Also, if you go to Options, make sure that Auto Render Region is turned on, because what you'll find is sometimes if you only want to choose one particular part, you don't want to have to take the time to render your entire image. Let's say, for example, that I didn't like that yellow. And if I come over here and I select my yellow, and I'll change it to, let's say, white. Okay? Now, I'll open up my render again, and this time I'm simply going to drag over top of the area that I'm talking about, and when I let go, it's only going to re-render that area. We haven't changed anything else, so that's actually a good thing. Okay? Also, if you, let's say, for example, wanted to change, let's just do a color again. We'll change this to orange. You don't have to render the entire thing. You can actually just render a portion of it and say, maybe I do, maybe I don't, maybe that's what I'm looking for. And you can decide on your own, okay? So it's just another really easy way of like speeding things up, of just rendering a portion of that frame. And notice that it's happening much faster than if I was rendering the entire scene. Okay? Now the next thing we're going to start talking about is using objects that you personally have affected. I'm just going to delete all the objects out of the scene, even the light. Let's say, for example, that you've been building your objects and you come across something that has been changed. Okay? Now, we know that if we, extend and we can extrude, and we can begin to really change and affect the overall shape and size of our objects, right? Well, that's certainly a lot different from what it started out looking like, right? We started out with a cube, and now we have this sort of, column-like thing, and it's a lot of bits and pieces. And if we go into object mode and we select it, if I come over here into my polygon options, notice that, well, here, I'll make a new polygon box just so you can see. Now this is a polygon cube, and this is how a polygon cube is arranged inside of its textures. Have you guys ever made one of those paper dice? This is what you do, so that the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5, and the 6 get folded over top of each other, right? So you can say, here's the 1, and there's that one face. Here's the next face, okay? Well, look at this. I select this other object. It still has that same layout. That's because all of these new bits and pieces, Maya has not taken the liberty of increasing or changing the UVs for me. That means that when I'm finished with my object, whether this be a table, a chair, a decorative ornament, anything, okay, it is up to us to create a UV map that solves the problem of what this object should look like. Now, there are some ways to make this object more understandable, okay? And honestly, it all comes down to practice. This is not something that I can say every single time this will always be the cure, all right? Sometimes your objects are just complicated, and they have to be taken very, very seriously, slowly. Other times, something might be able to be assumed, and you might be able to kind of cheat and get away with something. For example, let's go and just open up my Hypershade again, and let's use the object that we started out with, right? This was the beach ball. And here's the way that Maya thinks that the beach ball texture should be sitting. Okay, so we notice that we're getting hardly any blue whatsoever. We're getting just a tiny little touch here. This is not doing anybody any good, right? Well, depending on your texture, depending on the shape of your object, and depending on the complexity of how you want those two things to work together, there are ways that you can simplify this project. Okay, now I'm going to go and I'm going to remove my camera view. I'm going to go back to here. I'm going to go back to camera settings, and I'll choose no gate just so that we're back to this view. And I'll shrink this down for now, and I'll close this out for now. Now, if we really wanted to, we could, in fact, choose a plane. And first, notice this. I select this, and this is what I get. That's because that all 4 of the points, 1, 2, 3, 4, are stuck flat on top of each other. This is simply because while I was building this cube, because it was extruded from an original object, it started here, I've not told it to do anything else. Okay? Now I'm going to go to object mode, select my object, and I'm simply going to look at it straight on. If I go to create UVs, and I go to my planar mapping, this is underneath polygon options, by the way, and I go into my option box, there should be one set to project from the camera. Okay. Now, when I do this and I hit project, look at what I get. I get this little doohickey, whatever you want to call it. It is a set of handles, almost like the transform tools inside of Photoshop, right? I can grab hold of a corner, and I can grab hold of an edge, and I can change the way that this object sits on this, right? Let's say, for example, that that's going to be a good start. I'm going to then go and right-click on my UVs, right-click here, go to UVs, and I can marquee over everything. I now have all of them selected, and I'm simply going to rotate the entire thing 90 degrees. Notice that as I do that, my stripes are going in the opposite direction. Now, this is just a really good example of how to change the object and how to change its location and how each one of these different pieces can fit inside of these different areas. Let's say, for example, and I'll make sure that UVs are selected, I select the bottom of, let's just call this the head, if this was like a little robot or something. And I'm going to move them so that all of the faces inside of the head area, they're now red. Then I'm going to make sure that all of the faces for the neck stay pink. Then I can make sure that the torso and the arms. Now, because these are solid colors, this is working really easily. And I'll show you what happens when we start getting into more textured image maps. Okay. All right. So there we go. Now we're starting to break up the colors, and they're starting to make a lot more sense now, right? So it looks like I did it all on purpose. However, let's say, for example, if I open up that shader again, and by the way, if you didn't already do this, go ahead and take all of the textures that are currently sitting in there for you. There were your first two stone textures, but you may have noticed that there are more in there now. Go ahead and copy all of those to your source images folder now as well. And if we move over to our, well, first delete history, because there's a lot of tabs in there we don't need anymore. So we go to edit, delete by type, history. Now all those tabs are gone, we don't need them. And go to my Fong. I'm going to break connections on my ramp, and I'm going to choose to use a file instead. So inside of source images, there's my stone texture that I want to use. I'm going to use stone 12. Well, notice that that is certainly not doing me any good. If you've ever played a really low-end video game or an older video game, you've probably seen this 1,000 times. This is because if we select the object, this particular face is trying to show you all of this across a very large area. So when we start to build our objects, knowing what they're going to be and how they're going to be textured becomes very important. If we know for a fact that this is going to be a robot made out of stone, okay, then we have to take that into account. Also, if I select all of these faces, I can come up here and say create UVs and use that same planar map option, and that starts to make it look right. But look, we're still projecting it in one direction based on what I was looking at, which is why it looks okay accurately here, but when I start looking this way, now they're angled wrong, now they're stretched wrong, okay? So as we start to explore all of these, just understand that each time we add a texture, each time we start to do things, we're increasing the complexity of our object. Now, I will say this. If, for example, you were in the process of making your room, and you wanted the floor to be our stone. I right-click on the face that I want and right-click and say Assign Material to Selected. Okay, there's my checkerboard. Now, looking at it from here, I'm just going to straighten out a little bit. I can also use my widget, which is underneath my Settings and Preferences, View Cube, and I just have to turn it on because I normally keep it off. So there's my View Cube. So if I hit Bottom, Create UVs, Planar Map. Now I have this little doohickey that I can actually set by hand exactly how I want my floor to look like. So that looks okay. I think I'll stay there. Then I can right-click, choose Faces, choose all the walls, and make them bricks. Now notice that these bricks definitely do not work for this. So I'm going to choose one side and then the opposite side, because when we're doing a planar map, we're projecting it straight on. So if I hit back, I go Create UVs, Planar Map. I can look at it. There's my planar, and I can increase or decrease the number of edges that I want. And I'll do the same thing to these two sides, this one and its opposite. Click here, straighten it out, create, planar map, shrink it down, make it match. So now when I look inside of it, I have a dungeness brick wall texture and a really nice looking floor texture. Okay. Now, as we start getting into the more sophisticated objects, talking more about UVs and how to handle them, those are going to be things that we'll be talking about later. But I just want you to understand that for now, simple textures, simple layouts, simple objects can have very sophisticated textures. And in fact, you can have multiple textures on a single object. So if I, let's say, make a blin, and I'll turn that on the ceiling, assign material, let's make that greenish color, just so that when we come in here and I make my light, let's go point light again, 7, turn on shadows, do a test render. There we go. All right, now, once again, I'm looking at a picture of brick that is very flat. Now, hopefully, if you select your object and delete history, all of the tabs down here will be your different shaders that are attached to this object. And here's my Fong 1. I will call this Stone Walls. And go to Bump Map. Let's real quick, it says Stone 12. Hopefully I grabbed Stone 12 Bump Map. Stone 12 Bump. By the way, you can use the original image as the bump map, but a black and white version of it just gives you more control, just to let you know. So let's knock this down quite a bit. Let's just make this 0.3, and we'll see how that looks. Alright, so already we can see we definitely have some more believable shape. We definitely have some more believable lighting. And even just with that subtle adjustment, we're really starting to create something that feels more believable. Same thing with the floor texture. Now I'm going to go and select my light, and let's move it closer to my wall. And let's render it now. Let's see what it looks like. Alright, so we can see here we've definitely begun creating an enormous amount of texture. This is starting to look really, really nice. Now, it does have that very shiny quality, and that shiny quality is because I'm using a Fong to do it. Now, the Gaussian power is the shininess, and the specular color is the shine itself. If I simply bring down the Gaussian power and increase the Gaussian, or actually let's decrease that and decrease the color itself. And let's even turn that grayish color into maybe like a little bit of a greenish gray and render it again. You're going to see it's not as shiny anymore, but it still feels like that old textured wall. It just doesn't have that sharp shine as if somebody went over it with some gloss paint. All right, now let's see. You may notice that on many of the shiny surfaces, the fongs and the blends, there's an option here for reflectivity, and it's set to 0.5. Currently, there is nothing that is reflecting, but the reason isn't because of the shaders, it's because of the options inside of your rendering editor. Okay? Understand that just like shadows have to be turned on, so does the option as to whether or not objects should reflect one another. If an object isn't supposed to be reflective, and I'm assuming that a textured gray stone wall would not, I'm going to knock this down to 0, even if I don't intend to turn on reflections. If I don't turn that on, I'm still going to put this to 0, because if by chance I start rendering this and I do want reflections on, let's say for example I wanted to build a mirror and have, you know, a magic mirror up here on my cave wall or my dungeon wall, when I do turn on reflections, I'm going to basically shoot myself in the foot because of all these other objects that do have reflectivity already turned on, and I'm going to have to go through it at that point and turn them all off. So when you're making your shaders, go ahead and assume, okay, this is an object that will or will not have reflectivity regardless of whether or not you ever use it. Okay? All right, now up until this point, you may have noticed that we've been talking primarily on polygon objects. The reason is because with NURBS objects, your rules are much more simplified. Okay? Now, before anybody gets into it, yes, there are of course ways that you can affect textures. However, remember when we first looked at one of these objects and I showed you that the end sweep, what we're really looking at are two curves that are making a surface, and we just happen to be wrapping it around? Well, this object's UVs are always corner to corner. That means that no matter what I attach to it, if it's, and I'm going to open up my Hypershade again, if it's a texture that can be wrapped, it will always look right. Okay? Now, the reason being is because with polygons, I can select a face, actually select this face, and I can extrude it. And suddenly, Maya forgets what any new polygons were supposed to look like. So let's say if I select all of these, we have this awful zigzag appearance, and I'll click the back. Now that I'm looking at this straight on, I'll select you, you, and even you. And I'll say create planar. And now those will fit properly. Then I have to select these, create a planar map, scale it properly. And what I'm doing is I'm looking at it from the side so that I know what the overall relative shape is supposed to be. And then do the same thing to these. And notice that because this one's a little bit fatter, I'm going to pull it long, then scale it down, because I want it to match the size of the other polygon faces around it. And now we have a stone inset. See? You cannot do things as easily with a NURBS object. Now, are there ways to do it? Yes, of course there are. Will we be getting into it? No, not right now. Okay. Modeling with NURBS is a bit more tedious, and it's so much easier to simply build your polygon surfaces. Now, there's something else that I need to point out, and I'll just delete that for now. When, for example, you want to create additional details, such as bevels. We talked about bevels. So if I come over here and make a beveled shape, and I increase the segments, and I reduce the offset quite a bit, let's just go to 1. There we go. Notice that we have lost information here. See how it's invisible? That's because these are brand new faces. Maya doesn't know what we should have on these faces. So I'm going to go over with all of those selected, open up my hypershade, turn that off, open up my hypershade and apply the stone material to it. And now I have to work a little harder to make sure that all of these pieces are lining up together. Okay, so the easiest way to do that would be to choose an area and decide whether or not these should be part of this. And in my case, I would actually make sure that all of this, if possible, make sure that entire thing was all one piece of a map. Okay, because right now you can see they're kind of all over the place. They're not all together. We have this over here, we have these over here, we have that over there. See, all of a sudden we have these pieces that are outside of that. I know that right now it might seem a little complicated. I ask you this. While we're still learning, please don't allow yourself to go completely insane. All right? We will be getting into more detailed things like that, but not right now. And the reason that we're not doing it now is because I don't want anybody to become stressed out. You know, there's too many things to go over to really just concentrate on one piece of a problem. Okay. However, notice that already we're getting a better quality image. We would just have to make some subtle changes. We'd grab these, and all we'd have to do is really scale them until it fit a little better. See? And once the lines started to match up better, then I would say that that would be okay, and then I would just go about continue working. I'd come back to that later, really. For now, I just want you to get into the habit of attaching shaders. Be sure to name them. It's important to name them. This would be ceiling. This would be ceramic floor. Because this is only the second week, or the beginning of, you know, the third week, and I'm not interested in perfection. I'm interested in the overall. We're going to look at things and we're going to know instantly whether or not everybody is kind of getting it. Finessing, making some adjustments, refinement, all that stuff is coming in time. That's why your first assignment was to build objects, and then we talked about how to use some tools to make them a little bit more believable, a little bit more realistic, that sort of thing. Okay? So that means that while you're working on your projects, while you're getting things settled, while things are beginning to make sense to you, I'm only showing you a few steps, right? Notice that once we come up here to create UVs, we have much more options inside of this, but I'm only showing you the planar map because I want you to first get comfortable with just the idea And then once we have that, I'll show you what all this madness is really intended for. Okay. Now I'll say that if we have let's go with a polygon cylinder, and I'll increase that size, and then we'll increase the subdivisions going upward. Change that like this. Here's a tool that you may have seen before, and I'll increase this just a little bit more. There we go. Go to Mesh, Sculpt Geometry tool, and hold down B to resize. We're going to have to go a little bit more, manually drop that down because the brush is still a little too big. And we'll go to push down. Maximum displacement will be remarkably small. And then just kind of push around. Okay. And then I'll use go into my animation, go to create deformers, go grab a lattice, grab my lattice points, move them over a bit. Let's pull this closed, pull it down a bit. There we go. Okay, so then I'll go into my object mode, edit, delete history. I'm sure by now you've already figured out what I'm going to do. Okay, and then, well, obviously we need a texture for this object, so let's take a look at what we have in our arsenal. Let's go to my hypershade, and I'm going to choose a Lambert, and with that one selected, I'll hit the enter button so that it kind of empties everything else away. And let's kind of look around. Let's see what we can use. Now, many of you might think that the best course of action would be to choose the actual wood texture. Well, we can certainly start with that, and I'll just use my middle mouse button and drag this on top of it and choose color, so that we have this piece of wood grain material. Highlight all of those, right click, and assign. Okay. Now, that might be exactly what we want, but then again it might not be. It all depends. Aha, there you go. So right away we notice that it's not looking like we would expect it to. That's because as a 3D texture, this little node is actually controlling that texture. And as I move it around, you'll notice that it is actually changing. So what I need to do is I need to scale it relative to the size of my object. Now when I re-render it, it's beginning to create that wood grain. However, because this texture is of wood grain, it would look great on a table or something that was not the outside of a tree branch. Okay, so I'm going to delete that, and we're going to go back into my Lambert, and I'm going to break connection because I don't want to use that. Instead, I'm going to open this up, and I'm going to slide down, and let's go with a noise. A noise texture is called a procedural texture. That means that it's something that exists inside of Maya, and doesn't require any file outside of it. Now, if I render it right now, you'll see that what we end up with is just a very generic kind of splotchy quality to it. However, if I increase some of my settings, and a lot of times this is just the matter of playing around with it until you get something that you like, okay? And let's re-render just a piece of it. Now we're starting to get something that, kind of could work. Let's just keep going and see where this takes us, okay? Now, for color gain, yes, I could, if I wanted to, simply slide down here underneath color balance and change my white to more of a brown color. If I did that, now I'm looking at, of course, brown with a black surface. It's starting to look good, but are branches always the same color? No, of course not. I'll go once more and I'll choose something else. Let's go with, well, why not? Let's choose a ramp. Now, obviously, we don't want this magical Technicolored dream coat. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to choose my green, and I'm going to make it a shade of brown. I'm going to choose my blue, and I'm going to choose a different shade of brown, and then I'll choose my red, and I will make it yet again a different shade of brown. Now, there's something that's going to happen here. Because we have the ability to change it from linear or smooth or maybe a bump, meaning, one area pushes at the other, what I can also do is I can change the way that all of this really works, okay? Each one of these is going to change the way that this ramp lives on this surface. I can also slide down here and increase what's called the waviness of it. I can increase the noise, and look what starts to happen inside of my preview. I can increase the noise frequency, increase the noise itself, and what I'm going to do now is, because the bottom and the top are beginning to force each other together, I'm going to take that same color brown that exists here, just click inside of it, and I've made a duplicate of it. I'm going to drag it down. This is going to help me to create what I hope will be a quite nice wood texture. So now if I go back to my render, try that. Okay, now it's starting to look a little bit too clunky because of that brighter color. I'm just going to knock that one out. I don't like it anymore. There we go. That's going to feel a lot more natural. The last thing that I'm going to do is jump all the way back to my texture, open up my hypershade, select my Lambert, open it so I can see everything, and then I'm going to go and let's create just a basic simple bump map, and we'll go and choose, let's go with a fractal. A fractal is basically like, one of your Photoshop setting plugins, very basic, and I'll keep it, probably, let's go with 3.3 as a bump. And we'll see how that looks. Notice that doing a lot of test renders is really important. Aha. Okay, so after a little bit of playing around, we can see that this is definitely starting to feel a lot more like wood. Now there's one more step that we can do, and we've already looked at it. What if this was already burning? Well, let's take a look at what else we can do with this, and I'll open up my hypershade again. Let's say, for example, that I want my incandescence to have a fractal texture on it as well. Well, right now, that's going to make it look ridiculous. Right? It just means that everything looks like it's turned on. We definitely don't want that. But what I can do is I can reduce the amplitude, force the threshold, change the ratio, and just kind of play around with some of these settings until I get something that I really like. There we go. Now, it's going to be a little strange because the first time I render this, it's not going to look right. Right? That's definitely not what we're looking for. What I'm going to do next is to go down to Effect and invert it. By inverting it, I'm turning everything that was white black and everything that's black white. Do a little test render again. And now we have just a few areas that are going to be bright. So now, with that, let's go ahead and give it a red color and see how that looks. All right. So we have, in a very short amount of time, talked about incandescence, bump mapping, texturing, UVs, laying out UVs, and the last thing that we're going to do, just for effect, will be to take that single light, bring it all the way inside, put it nice and low with that, and I'm going to change the color of my light to a more softer, warmer orange, so that when I render it, it's definitely starting to feel like it's coming from this. Now, I can always make subtle adjustments to my shader. And if I go into my incandescence, for example, if my intensity isn't high enough, or if my brightness isn't bright enough, I can make it more powerful. I can also, and I haven't really shown you that part yet, but since we're already here, if I go down to Special Effects, I can turn on this glow intensity ever so slightly. And now it starts to look like it's actually glowing. Okay? So, pretty quick, we have a very interesting detailed piece of lumber using something just taken right out of Maya. Now, like I said, it's going to take some time to practice and play around with it, explore them, and I think that just to kind of dirty things up, you'll start to see that that's really helpful. Now, just to let you know, of course, that could have been something I could have made inside of Photoshop. I could have simply created a texture, and I could have created it so that it was 512 by 512 at 72 dpi. That right there is the lowest texture you want to create. Oftentimes, for like human characters and their details, you want to look at something more like 1024 by 1024. But for something as simple as the piece of wood, 512 by 512 would work just fine. And I could go in here and I could start painting. And then add my kind of grunge, dappled quality. It helps to have a darker color, I think. Oops. All right, so everything that you do inside of Maya or inside of Photoshop, it doesn't matter. As long as you keep understanding that what we're really doing is we're just constantly going over and making layers and changing the way that these objects appear so that when they end up back inside of Photoshop, it works just fine. Now, just to let you know, let's say, for example, this right here was the texture that you wanted it, you were happy with it, and everything else. In order to make that glow, you would do this. let's just go and do something really simple. I'll use my lasso tool and just kind of select some general areas, right? Some just little generic spaces that you would want. This would be where the glowing would happen, right? Well, you would choose a very bright red, which is what we did last time, but you would also do this. You would go in and you would make the rest of it black. Okay, so you want to have that same texture, just lay it over top and kind of make it a multiply so that it's still different, shades and different textures and things like that. And you can always do your blur, make a Gaussian blur out of it so that they're not very hard edged. And then you turn this and you save this as your incandescence map, and then just map it inside of Photoshop, or excuse me, inside of Maya the way that we did before. So with incandescence, you just say, hey, I want to make it a file instead of a fractal shader. All right. So you can start to see that we're at sort of a sky's the limit with doing this sort of thing. I encourage you guys to check it out, enjoy it, and I can't wait to see what you guys make. All right.